So let's go ahead and get started. Today is a very important pause as our world begins to reopen. Here in Chicago, restaurants are opening up. I'm able to sit on a patio. If I can't, I finally got my vaccine appointment for this Thursday. So this is the time for us to pause and consider our responsibility to the social sector, lest we get caught up in the new normal being the same normal that we had before the pandemic. So I'll start with a question. When was the last time on your commute or driving to an appointment that you noticed a pothole or an overpass or a sinkhole or something in need of structural reinforcement? And when you do notice those things, it's not your problem, right? It's somebody else's problem. If you're in Portland, Amy's joining us from Portland. If you're in Portland, you can call a pothole hotline, or Omaha, Nebraska, you can call a pothole hotline and somebody will fix the issue and you can carry on, right? Next time you come by, perhaps it's been filled. The infrastructure we rely on in civil society is just as vital, I would argue, for the day-to-day work of social programs, and yet it is invisible. It is nearly invisible. Or it was invisible till the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, the invisible became visible. And we realized there was no one to call. There was no hotline who could migrate nonprofits to fully remote mission delivery, purchase the tools, skills, security, access for them that they needed to pivot and survive. It was a very difficult moment for philanthropy. We faced the fact that as a sector, we have only invested at best 1% in our own infrastructure. So now is the time. Today, we are pausing to consider how we as a sector can address our own sinkholes, our crumbling bridges, our riddled roadways, the things that hold us back, that stifle innovation, that limit our impact, and frankly, also perpetuate inequity. Our timing here is really important. You may have seen the data from Candid and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. I think Sam will post a link to that article in the chat, but 1 in 3 nonprofits is in financial jeopardy as a result of the pandemic. And as grantmakers consider their responsibility to stabilize and even reimagine civil society, they, you, we are increasingly recognizing that social change in the digital era requires not just an investment in programs, but also an investment in technology infrastructure. I know this isn't headline making material. It's not going to tug at the heartstrings, but it is no less real. And many nonprofits are in crisis. In a minute, I'll share a story about when this realization first hit at least me and several of us on this call today. But first, I'd like you to just reflect back to exactly a year ago today. It's March 30th. Where were you March 30th in 2020? Where was your last meal before your particular community lockdown? Who was the last person that you hugged? The pandemic is filled with moments like this frozen in our minds, moments that really crystallize how monumental was the wave that overtook our everyday work, our lives, our families, our communities. One of these moments for me was actually through my work with TAG, with IT leaders at foundations throughout North America, the EU, the UK. I was on a call with them and we were all reeling. But I distinctly remember one community foundation in Minnesota. And on the call, they said, our grantees are in crisis. They need real help now. We're thinking, and they need real help with their technology. We're thinking of buying them Zoom licenses, Slack licenses. We're even considering opening up our own internal IT help desk to provide support for all of our grantees as they migrate rapidly to remote mission enablement. This was the call that prompted me this was my wake-up call. This was the call that prompted me to reach out to peers the panelists on today's session at N10, NetHope, and TechSoup to say, you know what, we need to do something here. Funders need to know how significant is this invisible gap in digital maturity. It's a real digital divide for nonprofit partners. Funders need to see this invisible gap, and they need to know that it's urgent. So the result was the two publications that you see on the screen, delivered in partnership in April and August of last year, really designed to elevate this need and provide tangible ways that philanthropy can help. And Sam Kaplan, an advisor to TAG on this project, will post these in chat for you. I also see people joining us in chat. Hello, Kari. Hello, everyone else joining us. Welcome. Sam will also post a list of the top pain points for nonprofits encountered during the pandemic. This was according to research by N10, TAG, and NetHope. So this emerging partnership, I'll call it, with N10, NetHope, TechSoup, has led to something even bigger, though. The shared belief that building back better means addressing this digital divide in skills, tools, funding, and more importantly, that building back better without addressing tech infrastructure is frankly lip service to genuine commitment. And so we are vowing together to do something differently and to make the case to the sector. But there's a real challenge. How do we talk about a complex need, right? Wicked complex problems are difficult to talk about, especially when they're invisible, like infrastructure, or at least digital infrastructure. So together with the folks I've mentioned, we lovingly call ourselves the Honeycomb Alliance. Together with the Honeycomb Alliance, we developed this framework to describe digital infrastructure. I won't go into detail here because we want to get to our chat with John Palfrey, but each component of this honeycomb is a critical component of the work of social change in the digital era. Each element, each component is necessary to create robust, sustainable, equitable, scalable infrastructure for our missions. So for example, imagine access there at the top right. Access to the internet is a real barrier, but once a nonprofit has access, do they have the tech tools they need? Do they have the skills to use those tools strategically and securely? Do they have the data literacy to measure their impact, gather data, drive informed decision making? And then perhaps even most importantly, do they have the funding they need to do this sustainably, securely, and with equity in mind? So today we are going to talk about this very wicked problem squarely. And if 2020 has asked anything of us, it is this. Now is the time to look in the eyes of a complex challenge and have the courage to do something about it. So thank you for being with us today as we attempt to do that together. I'm going to move forward in today's agenda, and we'll talk a little bit about what we're up to today. So our time together is going to be rich. It'll be full of some challenging calls to action, but we'll start with a fireside chat with one of philanthropy's leading thinkers on the role of the internet and society. We'll talk about why this matters. And then in the second half of today, we will talk about what you can do about it. So I am thrilled to introduce John Palfrey. While many of you know, John is the president of the MacArthur Foundation. You may be less familiar with his very extensive background as a scholar, an author, and a leader concerned about the internet, the intersection of the internet and society. Thank you for joining us today, John.
Chantal, thank you.
We, as I was mentioning, as we were doing our tech check, we have participants with us today from all over the world, from Vancouver, Canada, to Cape Town, South Africa, countless points in between. I appreciate you for making the time to be with us, John, and I appreciate for everyone's time to join us for today's session. So, John, these conversations, given your background about the role of technology in our world, they're not new for you. You're one of the few foundation presidents who is frankly a digital native, but you're also a scholar whose career has focused on this work. I wonder, as we warm up, if you wouldn't mind sharing a bit about your story, and how that makes the role of digital infrastructure important to you, as well as the MacArthur Foundation, as the foundation considers and prioritizes and envisions a more equitable and inclusive recovery.
Chantal, thank you. And I'm just delighted to be with you all today. This is something that on my calendar I've been really looking forward to. I'm sure we all have those things on your calendar that you are dreading, and those things that are a pleasure. And I'm really looking forward to this one. And I want to give a shout out to you and all members of the Honeycomb Alliance, and TAG and N10 and all the groups that are represented here today. And particularly John Moore, the IT director at MacArthur Foundation, who's just an amazing colleague and friend and does a fantastic job. So, and of course, his entire team, if any of them are here too. And I'd start, I guess, with one story that's not so much my story, but all of our story from a year ago. And, you know, I was 6 months into my time as a foundation president, and John and I had a number of talks about various things, his long-term investments in digital infrastructure. He was talking about the fact that we were on blue jeans and maybe we should consider another system for our video conferencing. And I said, well, you know, I think Zoom is pretty good. Maybe we should start transitioning to that. This is the beginning of March. And we decided to do a practice day to go try work from home before, you know, as the pandemic was starting to come into view. And we ended up going on a practice day in early March on a Friday, where everybody went home and worked from Zoom, which, you know, was something we were a week into using at a maximum. And really incredibly, John Moore and his team pulled off a work from home on a totally new system, totally on a dime. And we never went back after that practice day, in part because the practice day went so well and people were able to show that they could work remotely. And we have offices at that point, we had offices in 4 parts of the world. We now have offices in 3 parts of the world. And we had a board meeting coming up a few weeks later. And John managed to pull off a board meeting entirely on Zoom, a system that we hadn't actually ever used before. 2 weeks before, which, when you can think about that, it's really just an astonishing accomplishment. And so so grateful for a couple of things. One, the extent to which for years, of course, John and his team had been investing in digital infrastructure that could be virtualized. It could make a virtual environment just like that, which I think if you had not been making those investments, you simply couldn't have turned the way that he did and his team did, you know, really on a dime. And then for the rest of the year, what's been so incredible, you know, one is we just haven't had terrible problems. And in part, I think that was because of all those investments. I often think of it as the dog that doesn't bark. I don't know if you know those Sherlock Holmes stories in which he solves the mystery because, you know, the dog didn't bark and therefore the dog knew the person who was the killer or whatever, right? In some ways, you know, the problems that don't happen are the dogs that don't bark because they've been anticipated, right? All these good things that happen. I'm knocking on every bit of wood that we have here. But it's allowed us then to shift into a more strategic mode. And we can talk more about that. But really what I would say is that, you know, the story of this year, I think, has been the value of preparation, the value of hard work, getting ready in a way that allowed us to operate, and really then ultimately to serve our grantees and to serve the communities we wish to engage in. And I care about this because this is my field. I was a scholar in the field of digital media. I taught at Harvard Law School for 10 years, was director of a research center, then called the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, now called Berkman Klein Center. So I love this stuff. I geek out on it. I was vice dean of the school in charge of IT and other aspects, including the library. And so I love this topic and really grateful to have a chance to talk with you about it. But really to all of you, and I'm sure that my story at MacArthur is far from unique, all of you who have gotten us through this year plus of pandemic, I'm just so grateful.
You know, I'm going to pause and highlight that gratitude, John, because there are innumerable people on this call who enabled their organizations, whether they were foundations or nonprofits, to pivot rapidly and seamlessly. And they are the unsung heroes of the mission enablement of the sector. So thank you to all of you who did the same.
Absolutely.
So John, in prepping for this, you know, we also talked about a book that you wrote. So you wrote a book called Interop, and it was prescient in many ways. It was about the role of interoperability in the digital era. And one of the things that you said in that book was that nearly every element of life now relies upon new invisible information channels that have become essential components of the global economy. And so I'm wondering, civil society at this point, it can't be any different, right? How is digital infrastructure an essential component of the social sector?
Well, thank you, Chantal. One of the reasons I was so excited to be with you is the chance to talk about this book, which is called Interop. I think it was Interop, The Promise and Perils of Highly Interconnected Systems, if I remember the subtitle right. And I'm definitely not here to sell any books. This is a book from about maybe 10 years ago. It may or may not still be in print, but I've written or edited 10 books in my scholarly work. This is the book that in some ways I have the most fondness for and would probably have sold the fewest copies. And in some ways, I think may have had the biggest impact. If you look at the European Union's regulations around interop, they're based largely on the work that we did at Berkman Center around interoperability. And honestly, the credit goes to my co-author, Urs Gasser, who's a professor, a Swiss professor, who works now still at Harvard. Urs has been on many airplanes between the US and Brussels. And it's, the European Union has been much better on regulating and supporting interoperability within the tech sector than the US has. And now, in all these conversations that we're having about Section 230 reform, you probably know, there are all these discussions about, and platform accountability, all these questions about whether we would require or mandate interoperability in some way. So all of a sudden, this topic, 10 years later is hot. I guess to answer your specific question about digital infrastructure, the story I told about John Moore and the team is the reason for it, which is to say, if you make these investments that are like, as you said, roads and bridges and so forth, especially when they're not needed, when you're slightly ahead of the game, when they're not totally crumbling, you make these investments, you create the infrastructure, you can then do more strategic things. And so the way that John Moore and I have been talking about this is let's do the things that have the 6 nines uptime and all that stuff. And you've got to do that. That's like the ante, that's the infrastructure. But then it allows you to do things that are connected to your mission. So our mission right now is to be, in a broad sense for MacArthur, it's to create a more just, verdant, and peaceful world. But really specifically what we're aiming toward is an equitable and inclusive recovery coming out of the pandemic. And so we are focused on racial and ethnic justice in particular. We're seeking to ensure that organizations that have not had as much power and force and place at the table are able to do that they can access our grant making systems more simply, that we can process grants more easily, that we can deal with reports and so forth much more simply. And if we invest together in digital infrastructure that is both connecting foundations and those we serve, as well as something that allows us to be much more interoperable in the way that we interact, and with lower barriers to entry, which is something we all, I think, strive for our partners and our grantees and our investees, that's very powerful. So I think that the connection between the Interop book and today and this process is really saying, how do we create effectively, appropriately interoperable systems that allow us to do some more strategic things that as a sector will bring about a more equitable, inclusive recovery.
So, John, we've talked about in Interop, you also talk about other sectors where that vision of interoperability and that investment infrastructure, it was clear that the benefits of that were many, and yet they somehow used to do it, right? They somehow were not able to make that shared investment. Do we see a parallel challenge and potential in the social sector? I know that's a loaded question, but I'm going to ask it. And
the answer is yes, from my perspective, of course, Chantal. So I say a couple of things on that. One is in that book, I did not write about philanthropy. I hadn't thought about being a foundation president or being really involved in philanthropy at all, other than as a board member, which I've been at Knight Foundation for a long time. But mostly I've been a grant seeker. I've been asking for money and needed it for our projects and our work. So I really didn't think about that at the time. And that is, I think, where you all can kind of fill in the blanks. But I'll give a specific example that I think is very important today, which has to do with health data. So, and we did write about this in the book, which is right now, as you know, there is no infrastructure to share in a safe, private, secure, way the data about all of us related to our health situation. And in a pandemic, that's problematic. So one problematic way is that, in order to do testing and tracing that would contain the virus, we need a way that would allow us to know whether somebody had been, was infected, and to do it in a way that would allow somebody to travel from one town to another, one, state to another, much less one country to another. And we literally have no way to do that. And people do not trust, of course, the big tech companies, the Apple, Google, effort to do it through our smartphones and so forth, for lots of reasons. That they have not earned that trust. In fact, they have jeopardized that trust. So we don't actually have a mechanism for doing that. And you may have seen there's an article today, I think in the Washington Post, that was looking at vaccines and talking about the way in which the records we have now for if you've been vaccinated, which I haven't been, but you will be tomorrow. Once you have that, do we have a way to share those data in a way that are in fact safe, appropriate? We're protecting, the privacy rights of individuals, but also allow you to travel or do whatever you need to do. That's going to have to be across jurisdictions, right? That's not just going to work in Chicago or in Oregon or wherever you are. Sorry, I mixed a city and a state there, but you get the point, right? Across municipalities, states, countries, and so forth. We're going to need some infrastructure there, and you can see how this is a life and death matter if we are able to do that well, not sort of a trivial thing at the edge of the organization. And I think we can go specifically from there into examples in philanthropy, but I think it's just right in front of us as a health matter right now.
John, you talk about something that I'm sure is on people's mind when we talk about data sharing and we talk about interoperability. We talk about the rise of tech systems. What's the cautionary note? Right, increasing connectedness, interconnectedness. How do we ensure that how are we judicious, right, in our adoption of digital infrastructure, and how do we ensure that it is used to lift all boats and not to perpetuate the inequity and disparity of the past?
Yeah, so I'd really say two things. One is equity, and the other is around sort of privacy and security and so forth. So the equity argument, of course, is if we rush ahead and we simply go for the most advanced technology and the highest degree of interoperability, we will leave people behind, right? As you noted in your intro, Chantal, so well, MacArthur Foundation, with its $7+ billion in the bank, is going to have a better digital infrastructure than most of our grantees, right? Virtually all of our grantees, much less the community organizations and others that many of our grantees then serve and work with. And so we can't level up in such a way that's fun for us and exciting, for $1 billion organization, in a way that actually doesn't work for everybody else. And so one of the arguments in this book, Interop, that we made, and again, I'm not trying to sell books, but to just give the example, is that it's actually not about optimal levels of technology or optimal levels of interoperability. It's about, maximal, it's about optimal. So you're trying to figure out for the organizations, for the world we're in right now, how do we create a set of systems that can work for everybody and get the job done, basically, as opposed to making it super spiky and super inaccessible for some and super wonderful for others. So that's, I think, a really important way to think about it. And I actually don't think technologists tend to bring that lens to the work. And I'm not criticizing technologists, but I just don't think it's something that, how many times have you had that discussion at the beginning of designing a technology system? Usually not starting with equity, right? But I do think we need to do that and introduce it appropriately. And of course, there are some organizations on here who I'm sure do that, but I don't think typically that's the case in a software company or a big technology company. And the second really is privacy and security and so forth. So if it's a perfectly interoperable system, you can have information flow, too easily, too quickly, right? So there might be, I'm just take an example with the health data example. You might allow for the data you need to flow about the vaccine, but you might also be then sharing, something that the person had revealed. Is that person, or had that person been pregnant at some point? Is that person in the LGBT community? Something that is totally irrelevant, right, to the thing that needs to be shared, which in this case is this person vaccinated or not? And so you need to figure out that the system has to be designed in such a way as to have, speed bumps or break walls, if you will, that basically protect some of the data and share other parts of the data. And that, of course, is harder to design than it is to describe just in shorthand like that.
Your timing couldn't be better, John. We just announced TAG as an organization, just announced yesterday our new mission and vision, which was co-created with our community. And it was a shift from, I would argue, perhaps for tech's sake, like we're promoting the value of technology and philanthropy, to we are enabling the mission of philanthropy, right? We are advancing, how can technology advance the mission of philanthropy instead of just be the end instead of the means. As we begin to wrap up, and we'll open it up for Q&A in just a second. So use the Q&A function down at the bottom. I see we have at least one question already queued. I am wondering, John, how would you advise us all to make this case, right? It's not, like I mentioned earlier, this isn't headlines and heartstrings kind of stuff, right? It's not deeply inspiring language around investing in digital infrastructure. I mean, it is to you and I, but perhaps not to the broader sector. What will it take to change the way that philanthropy invests in its own infrastructure for the social sector?
Thanks, Chantal. First of all, I really think the new mission you've adopted, which you shared with me in advance, is terrific, and I love the pivot and the shift. It makes a lot of sense, and of course, it's consistent with this conversation and all the things I've heard you and your colleagues talking about. So it's great. I do happen to think, I saw someone write in the chat that it's not sexy. I think it is sexy. I think it's very exciting, and I think that on its own, I think that the case has been made by this past year. Honestly, whatever those millions of dollars in investment over a period of time for a large organization have paid off this year in a way that allowed us to operate. So I think there are some just sort of screamingly obvious cases for this work. But I really would go to this strategic point, which is, if you do the work well of creating the infrastructure that's shared, I think there's so many things we can do as a sector. So one of the things that we are eagerly exploring and welcome more partners with, is could we have more of a common application infrastructure? This is something I know you put in your Honeycomb, and Sam Kaplan and others who are adjacent to and friends with MacArthur Foundation are helping with that. And so there are many people to be in touch with. We're eager to say, look, if colleges and in fact even selective high schools can get together and can share with a common application, I believe that we as philanthropies are not so special that we couldn't do the same thing, that we could make it much easier for those who are interacting with us. And I think if you then were to be in an environment where you had a common application system, or at least largely common or somewhat common, then you can think about the reporting mechanisms. Could we make it easier for people to report? Do they really need to do a bespoke report for all of us, right? And then I think we could be thinking about how could we share information in strategic ways across sectors in better ways. So, obviously there are companies who have devoted themselves to doing this as grants management systems and otherwise. There are lots of ways to look at this, but I do think that the more that we have effective interoperability and the more that we bring down barriers for connectivity and access to us as organizations, the more strategic things, the more interesting things we can build on top of it. And that's, to my mind, the best argument to a foundation president or whoever the person is you're trying to convince.
I see we've got some questions queued up, John, and I'd like to end with bringing it back to your role in the MacArthur Foundation, and we're talking about strategic leadership here. What do you envision as MacArthur's role in leading this change, right? In advancing a sector that is clearly existing in a digital era, but may not have fully realized that yet. What do you see as MacArthur's role?
Well, thanks, Chantal. I mean, I think being a good partner is always number one. I don't see MacArthur as, being head and shoulders in some different, dimension. I think that the idea is to be a great collaborator and to proceed with appropriate humility, which I think we have, noting that, we can be one player among many. We're a big foundation, a well-known foundation, but that we're not going to move the sector on our own. So we need to figure out how do we create those partnerships and collaborations. And of course, you are living testament to the power of doing that. And I really appreciate the work of this group. I think there are a variety of things that any organization can do, MacArthur among them. So one, we have a technology in the public interest grant making area, and that is trying to advance equity and so forth within the field, but then also to spread the knowledge horizontally within our organization, within our grantees. And so, on this topic about equity and safety and so forth, when there have been, I'll take an example, we have office in Nigeria. We have a lot of grant making there. Our technology and public interest team, along with our IT team, helps to advise our grantees about how to stay safe in a sometimes complicated, technology environment. So the things we can do both as a grant maker and then horizontally in the fields that we're working in. I also think that we can be a good partner as we try to create things like a common grant application or a digital infrastructure that we could work with together. Some of that, of course, is working with Flux with the grant management system that we use and otherwise. So I think there are a lot of ways in which we can use our role and our money and our time in such a way to be helpful. But I think that's going to be done with and through partnership.
And speaking of partnership, your time here today is extraordinarily generous. Thank you, John. I know that we have a few questions queued up. Sam Kaplan, if I might call on you, I think you've been managing those questions. Are there any that we want to ask of John with our few minutes left for some Q&A?
We do. So Tracy Konzak asks, what's the message to large data platforms that affect the day-to-day of nonprofit operations who aren't incentivized to create interoperability without a profit model?
It's a good question. Well, I mean, I think the message is, number one, interoperability can ultimately lead to extraordinary levels of profitability. You sometimes have to just see it a little differently. It's a little like, when open source tech, software came on the market, people were saying, we just have to be purely proprietary at all times because there's no business model. Of course, there are business models around open source, and a lot of big companies have made, in the billions of dollars on open source. So keeping everything proprietary is not always the best business model. And so, openness and connectivity does sometimes have a great deal of business, just revenue, straight revenue return. And Facebook is the best example of this, right? I mean, if Facebook had not opened up its platform and its API, it would absolutely not be Facebook. There's no question about it in terms of its role in the ecosystem. So I think part of it is just that super short-sighted. I think the second is that we, to the extent that we are the customers, I think we can demand it, right? I think we can say that the kinds of systems that we need and will invest in, and we'll invest in both in terms of paying the licensing fees, but also invest the time that we know our IT teams put in and our program teams put in to a system to try to help make it better over a period of time. And, I think we should be totally willing, and I don't know who you're talking about, but if there's one organization or a couple organizations that are doing this, we should walk away, right? We should find either another for-profit that's doing it or build it ourselves, because we do have, we have the heft to do that kind of thing. I'm not always for, let's build, actually I'm never for, let's just build our own special system over here. But a group of organizations saying we're not being served by the platform that we're all investing in, let's create it somewhere else. And someone else will gladly take our money, I think, and create that beautiful, appropriate, well-serving, equitably designed, interoperable system.
Sam, I see a few more questions. Maybe we can answer the one from Christine, and then we'll move into the second portion of our time.
Yep, sounds good. So Christine asks, is the conversation about a common application a casual conversation or an organized one that other foundations can join?
I would say somewhere right between, and Sam, you feel free to answer it yourself. So it's an invitation at this moment, just to say we're starting to talk about it with a handful of foundations, and we absolutely welcome partners. We also are trying to figure out how to engage grant seekers, the other partners in that conversation from an early stage. Please feel free to just shoot something to me, or I suspect Sam, you would be open to hearing, and John Moore as well at MacArthur if others are interested. It is something I'm deeply devoted to as a president, and I think we've got some other good partners in it, and we definitely hope it will be part of this Honeycomb Alliance efforts, and really plug it into the vision that Chantal and others have for what you're up to. And I think John's put his email in the chat, I see there, so definitely just reach him.
Great, you're noting that John Moore has just added his email address in the chat. That's great. So one parting question that I saw come up in chat, John, and I think this is a really inspiring way to end our time together. So Raja asked a question about what guidance would you give to leaders working in the tech sector who want to have an impact in the social sector?
It's a great question. I mean, I think it comes back to alignment. It comes back to alignment with the kind of core values and core strategic vision of the organization you're working with, or the organizations you wish to partner with. And that's again where I credit John and the team at MacArthur being so smart about really being aligned, thinking through what our approach is, and then figuring out how technology can be a major enabler of that. And if for whatever reason the person at the head of the organization or the people writing the checks or whatever the power structure looks like are not seeing that, then I think that's the place to make that case, and to basically to help those of us who are focused elsewhere sometimes, but on the mission, see the way in which technology can help. And even as somebody who came up in a way through the technology field, there are lots of instances and ways in which I'm just not going to see the affordances and the possibilities. And so that's why you need this partnership where people, you can be the person who points out the blind spot and says, hey, wait a minute, either you're messing this up, or this is a possibility, this is an affordance that technology, if only we went in this direction, could make possible for us or for our grantees, and tie that directly to strategic mission. And that is only going to grow over time, right, in this technological field. That this is not going away. And I think increasingly, to be a good executive in one of these organizations, you're going to need to be able to have that literacy and that ability. And so I think you can be, whether you are in the decision-making role or you're in a support role, you can be just a key partner in that way.
John, I cannot thank you enough for pausing with us to consider the many ways we can not just rebuild, but rebuild better, more equitably, more sustainably, more scalably. Thank you so much for investing in this conversation with us, but also inspiring us, right? As it would be very easy to lose track of this work as we rush to get back to normal. Thank you for having the courage to look at this very complex problem with us today. We'll move shortly into the second half of our time together to talk about what we can do about this. But I want to thank you on behalf of all of our members and the participants here for exploring why this matters now in our sector.
Chantal, thank you so much. And I hope if you take anything away, it's that MacArthur wants to be a great partner with all of you. And secondly, that I have great energy and gratitude for what you're doing. And really, truly, thanks for all you're doing to help bring about this equitable and inclusive recovery from this period, and all the great things we'll do together in future. So thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we will move back into we'll move back into our slide deck, into the second half of our time together. I'm going to do a few administrative things here. Okay, great. So we had a bit of a technical snafu earlier where you were seeing my notes and the slides. Is that still the case, or are you just seeing the slides now? Okay, great. Thank you. TAG is a small organization. We're doing this all the best we can. So we're back in business here. All right. So earlier, I spoke about that moment in April of 2020. Where with my peers at N10 TechSoup and NetHope, we realized how wide was that digital gap for nonprofit organizations. So yes, we published 2 papers together very rapidly in April and in August, urging philanthropy to respond, but we realized also that it wasn't enough. So in September 2020, thanks to some very responsive funding from the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund, the MacArthur Foundation, Octa for Good, and Salesforce.org, thanks to their rapid funding, I was able to launch a task force to catalyze awareness about this need for investing in digital infrastructure. And our question was, what would it look like if we could build an ecosystem of funders that really understood the strategic value of technology to nonprofits and were willing to invest in it? So what we'll do is, I want to mention also that this is the group of participants over those 6 months who were able to be involved. We met for 6 months. It was an exploratory process. It was messy, but the goal was very clear. We wanted to focus on shared priorities for digital infrastructure that A, answered real need for nonprofits, but B, also helped us build new ways of working together to move each priority forward. So I am deeply grateful to all the organizations who participated here. It is worth noting that the recommendations today do not reflect their endorsement It's not the endorsement of every member here, but we are all certainly much better informed because of their participation. And what resulted from that 6 months, the task force is now over, but we have a set of recommendations for what it would look like to build back better in a way that does address the inequities of a digital divide that was unearthed in the pandemic, or at least the extent of which was unearthed during the pandemic. So as you see in this honeycomb, there are a few priorities in orange. These have been prioritized because they met 3 criteria. Number 1, they meet a real priority need for nonprofits. Number 2, they leverage existing interest by funders. And number 3, they are a pragmatic place to start working together in new ways on this complex, wicked problem. So speaking of working together in new ways, I would like to introduce 3 members of this so-called Honeycomb Alliance, 3 very special leaders in the nonprofit Tech for Good space who have taken this journey with me. And Amy, Chris, and JL, what a year it has been together. Thank you for joining us in conversation today. We just spoke with John Palfrey about why this work matters. Now we want to turn to what we can do about it. But before we do, I actually want to ask JL if you can ground us a little bit in this new way of working together. This is different work as a collective. Ground us in the shift that you see.
Thank you, Chantal, and thank you, John. And I am so grateful that we are here because it is a step in a new way of working on a collective challenge, a way to move from I to we, a way that blends our independence of identity with the commitment of collective action. I think many of us are here today joined to establish a social compact amongst coalitions of grant makers and coalitions of nonprofits to not only give and get, but also to responsibly design together the foundation of a future digital society, which is its digital infrastructure. So at the onset of the 4th Industrial Revolution, and faced with a global need from a pandemic, it's a time for people and organizations to transform from I to we in order to build a just and equitable digital infrastructure for all. It is a time to not only operate as organizations, but, as we heard from John, to also interoperate to build a digital infrastructure that enables a just and inclusive digital world in the future. We call ourselves jokingly the Honeycomb Alliance, but very much like bees, we collectively need to be an eye that goes to the flowers and returns with nectar, and a we that from that nectar creates the honey that makes the future a just and equitable future. So let us all use the strength of our identity to exponentially grow the power of our collective action. Thanks.
JL, we didn't prep for, we didn't share what we were going to speak about, but that was really incredibly powerful, and it embodies the hard work that we have all done together, and the many countless partners who are also doing this work that have not been a part of this alliance, right? We started where we started. We started with our existing connections, and now is the time to even broaden that we, right? Before we do that though, I want to turn to talk a little bit about what the priorities are that emerged from the task force and the work ahead that will be done by this collective in a new way of working from I to we, and we being many funders funding a collective of organizations working on these challenges. So Chris Warm, if I could ask you to unmute yourself, talk to us about this priority project, this initiative that has emerged from the task force.
Sure thing. So hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today, and thanks for the comments, JL. Happy to describe one brick in the digital infrastructure road that we've been working on together through this process. A couple of things I would ask you all to think about. First, there are roughly 10 million nonprofits on the planet. Nobody really knows for sure, with 250 million odd staff or volunteers providing meaningful programs and services to basically everyone. And all of them, all of us, have to move to the cloud. Think about the nonprofits in your life when you were growing up. For me, that was swim team, Quaker meeting, choir, the adoption agencies that introduced me to my sisters. They all have to move to the cloud. Now, using the roughly 1.5 million organizations reached by TechSoup around the world as sample size, fewer than a quarter of these organizations have ever had any IT support of any kind ever. And some 70% of those found their work disrupted during the forced digital aspect of COVID. Do some napkin math and high science work with me. Some 80% of organizations on the planet are facing a forced migration to the cloud without any tech support. And that will plausibly disrupt at least 70% of their services. Even if I screwed up the math, and for the record, I was a music major, so it is possible that I screwed up the math. No slight to music majors, some of you do much better math than I do. Even if my math is off by some 10 to 20%, we're still talking about millions of organizations delivering critical services disrupted, and the communities that they serve already behind, often thanks to accelerating digitalization and a lack of infrastructure, fall further behind. So what can we do? Can we just fund our way out of this? What would it cost to cover it? Based on our reckoning, it costs about somewhere between $8,000 and $10,000 to move a small organization into the cloud, multiplied by all the nonprofits on the planet needing services, and we're talking an $80 to $100 billion challenge. And that still wouldn't get us there because they'd still need support and tech changes. They need training. I don't think we're going to fund our way out of this, but we can't afford to ignore it either. So how do we bring the cost down? How do we reduce barriers to cloud adoption at scale and sustainably? Well, one way out of many, through the TAG task force we've been scoping, are cloud starter packs, essentially blueprints to digital transformation tailored to specific types of nonprofits, supported by communities of practice to keep them evolving as technology does. For any of you who've tried to take care of your own tech or help somebody else who has, imagine being able to look up where to get started based on the kind of work you do, to have the guidance on what everyone else is using, the tools and integrations that have worked for them, links to guides to access, install, integrate, and ask questions. That's what we're proposing. Starter packs designed in partnership between nonprofits and technologists from the tech sector, from the support sector, to delineate the cloud integrations that will help them get up and running. Then share that knowledge, starter pack blueprints widely and with communities of practice so that anyone trying to get into the cloud or help others get into the cloud can get what they need when they need it, ask the questions they need, and get the support they need. To wrap up, COVID has shown us the risks of not taking this on, and the cloud keeps on coming. We need funders and technology assistance organizations to do this collectively, share openly, provide the critical piece of knowledge and community infrastructure, the smallest, most local amongst us, those we rely on for frontline services and communities who rely on them for support and representation need. You and the nonprofits you serve, those who serve you and probably your nonprofit or foundation need this infrastructure too. So hopefully, with all you've heard today, we'll be building some momentum around this critical piece of the equation and getting going. But that'll still only be a brick, a critical one for sure. We're also going to need the kinds of skill building and literacy training that Amy's going to talk about.
Wonderful. You have a comment actually in Q&A that this is a really extraordinary initiative, Chris, and I agree. I mean, this is a game changer. This is a game changer. It will require deep committed work and funding, but this could potentially change the tech space for nonprofits. So Amy, it's not just about tools. Let's talk about literacy, data literacy, tech literacy, and strategy. If you want to share a little bit about this priority initiative.
Yeah, if you don't know how to use the tools you have, it doesn't matter if they're really great or not very adequate, or maybe even if they really were, to use John's language, optimal. If you don't know what to do with them, it doesn't matter. You know, I want to acknowledge, I think that I saw her on say hello in the chat. But the majority of nonprofits in the US, the majority of nonprofits around the world do not have a John Moore. They have an Aki Shibuya, right? They have a staff person who has 3 different departments in their title. They have more work than one human could put into one scope. And technology becomes a component of that, but not a dedicated job, right? So actually getting to see what you're meant to do with technology takes capacity even beyond knowing, okay, how do I use this database that we have, right? There's a whole spectrum of growth and capacity building that the entire sector needs. It is 2021. I should not have to make the case that every staff person uses technology anymore. So really, truly, we need to build up those skills in every staff person, regardless of what their title is. Now, this webinar today, our panel, is very white and filled with people who have the privilege of fancy titles, right? Part of that is because this project that emerged through the task force hasn't been done. We have not actually mapped who all is doing this work, what those programs are, and who those programs are for against that honeycomb, so that it was clear for funders, if they're interested in advancing one of those 6 pieces, how they would do that. It's not clear how they could direct their grantees to programs that are appropriate for them, because there is no clear view. I met just 2 weeks ago a woman of color leading a technology capacity building organization that I'd never met before. I mean, even us as capacity builders don't know each other because the work is massive. And I want to just debunk anything around the reference to the Honeycomb Alliance. Let go of any white dominant thinking that says you need permission. Take that graphic. You're in the alliance. You want to do work to address this cause? You're in the alliance, right? This is not something that there's a gate around. We need all of us, all of you, using that, understanding this work through that kind of chart, so that we can all be moving in the same direction with the same map. And this project is to map projects against that, so that we can provide an even clearer path to what funding to scale looks like across all of those fields.
Amy, thank you.
Totally. I'm happy to get y'all on board any day. So I'm looking at the clock.
So being mindful of the clock, I will gloss over quickly the obvious. The third initiative that was prioritized out of this work is a micro campaign to change the perception of tech funding, right? None of this happens until the sector is willing to say tech is not overhead. In the digital era, tech is essential to mission enablement. And so TAG, being the Technology Association of Grantmakers, is proposing a small campaign over the next year to change this perception. I will move from this slide to 3 actions that we're going to skip right over Q&A. If you have questions, go ahead and ask them in chat, and our panelists will answer them for you. But I'm going to move to the 3 actions that you can take. Because the detail in each of the priorities that was just discussed can be found in that publication called A Responsibility to Rebuild. The work of the task force is highlighted in this 8-page document. And if you would like to fund this work, if you'd like to get involved in this work, the lead organizer from this Honeycomb Alliance, their email is included. There's greater detail on the initiative there. So for those of you who are committed to change and committed to this work, start with the first bullet item here. Download Responsibility to Rebuild and commit to investment. I think Sam will also post a link, URLs for each of these steps in the chat. If you are just starting now, right, and you want to contribute in a lighter weight way, TAG is also partnering with Grant Advisor on this second bullet, 100 forms in 100 days. The idea is to support exploration around the Common App, another thing that emerged on that honeycomb. By sharing your grant application with Grant Advisor and with TAG, we will be able to conduct some similarity analysis in order to understand how far are we? Perhaps your grant applications are already 70% similar. And if that's the case, a common or baseline app is a no-brainer. Just start there. And your 30% of unique application protocol can continue to be unique. So if you are able, share your grant application. We will not be publishing your application. We will be analyzing an anonymized aggregate form. Go ahead and visit that second link. And then lastly, if you would like to track this work, we will be holding quarterly meetings. The official task force is over. We're going to hold quarterly alignment meetings to check in with each other and the variety of folks doing this work, many of whom, as Amy mentioned, we do not yet even know, and you are part of the Alliance. So join us at the quarterly meetings and we will check in with each other and do our best to continue to align and advance this work. So I've included contact information for everyone here, but I want to close, by saying it's not the end. The task force may have ended, but frankly, this is really just the beginning of a new way of investing in the viability, sustainability, the more equitable sector. I'll end by setting an intention. And what I want to share and the intention I want to leave with is that rebuilding is our responsibility. The potholes, the sinkholes, the crumbling bridges, whatever of digital infrastructure, they're not as visible as those on the highway or in your community, but they are no less real. And if you are the technology lead in your organization, you have a special responsibility, a special burden on your shoulders as you leave this call. If you're responsible, if you're willing to accept it, for making the invisible visible to your organization, you are the advocate for investing more than 1% in infrastructure in support of the future of a more equitable, sustainable social sector. You are the one willing to look courageously in the eyes of a wicked, complex problem and say out loud that we can do something about this. So thank you for joining us today. Thanks to all of our panelists and presenters for sharing their heartfelt work in this space and their commitment to moving this forward. Please reach out to me personally if there's anything I can do to help you make the case for this work in your organization. We will send out the recording and the deck and resources mentioned on today's call later this afternoon. Thank you all so much. I will also hang back if anyone has any questions or comments.